Good evening everyone and welcome back to my channel. I am refilming a video on granulation. This is something I filmed a month ago and I just had surgery, as I've mentioned in a previous video, and when I rewatched it ready to edit it, it was so chaotic because I was slurring and skipping things and a bit of a mess really. So excuse me, I'm chewing gum as well. I'm so uncouth. I wanted to talk about granulation because it's one of the things I actually get asked about the most. Many people think granulation and staining are opposites, like north and south. It either granulates or it stains, and that's not true. Some colours don't really stain and they don't granulate either, so I want to explain what that means. A staining colour is simply a dye that has one or two things really. It's a low particle size normally, so it's something that can really seep into the narrow fibres of the paper, and something that has binding sites on the dye molecule that have affinity for cellulose paper and will adhere to it. So the paint then gets stuck in the paper, and no matter how much you scrub and you do things and you try to lift, you can't get that paint back up. So if you are wanting to do a glazing technique, which is where you paint on a colour, you let it dry thoroughly and you paint another colour over the top, and then what you've got is a thin transparent film over the top, and it's almost like you've put a coloured piece of cellophane over when you look at the colour, which is a very different effect to mixing the two together. If you want to do that, it's a good idea to use a staining colour on the bottom, because then when you paint over it, it'll stay where it is and it won't lift. Lifting is when the paint comes back up and goes into solution again. So I'm going to show you a bit of staining and I'm going to show you a little bit of granulation, because granulation is something that a lot of people fear, and actually you shouldn't. Granulation's a really good thing. It's one of the great beauties with watercolour is that we don't really paint, and I think a lot of watercolourists say this as well. We don't actually paint. What we do is slap paint on the page, and if we're lucky, the wetness of the paper and where we slap the paint cause the paint to spread around all on its own, and it produces a nice picture. So actually, that act of the paint spreading on the wet page is often what gives us the beautiful image. And part of that random, uncontrollable nature of watercolour, which, let's face it, is what most of us love, is the granulation and the fact that the paint changes once you put it onto the surface. Now, there are mediums that you can buy. There is a medium called granulation medium that you can add to any paint and it will make it granulate. It doesn't give a realistic granulation. It doesn't look like the real thing. It reminds me a lot of, any card makers watching will know glossy accents. Ranger also make a product called crackle accents, which looks like glossy accents, but it cracks. Granulation medium doesn't crack, but it kind of has that similar appearance of being very synthetic looking. So I don't use it. I stick with these paints granulate, these paints don't, and that's how we work. So what granulation actually is actually one of a couple of things. There's no such thing as granulation. There's a few different groups of things that make paint granulate. What that means is one of two things occurring principally. One is the paint doesn't like water, so it clumps together to get away from the water. That's called hydrophobicity. Hydro, water, phobia, to draw away from, to fear. So if you had, let me do a demonstration. I'll use these two bottles of dye. Let's imagine these are two molecules or two particles of dye, and we add some water, and these are now floating around in the water, and they chemically don't like water. They will attract to surfaces or to each other to get away from that, and that's called hydrophobicity. Now, if they attract to a surface, they'll stick on the paper. What they then will do is clump together and form aggregates. That's what you get with French ultramarine. That's called flocculation properly. Flocculation comes from like little particles of things all sort of coming together, so little specks coming together, and that's called flocculating. And if you were to do French ultramarine in a large beaker of water, it almost looks a little bit like chopped up pieces of wool, like little fluffy particles in there, and then when they dry down, that gives us the granulation effect that we want. and by mixing it with certain colours we can make it granulate more. If you mix burnt umber into French ultramarine, you will get an almost brick-like granulation. If you use other colours, you can soften it. You can actually use colours cleverly to layer them so that within the granulation effect, you've got a layer of granulation on top of a layer of colour. And you'll see that in my faking it video on Rose of Ultramarine, which is linked in the iCards now. That's an example of putting down a non-granulating colour with a granulating colour, and I'm going to show you some of that now as well. The other form of granulation is called sedimentation, and that's where a paint has simply got large heavy particles, like something like Caput Mortuum or some of the other iron oxide pigments, and it just sinks into the ridges of rough paper or cold press paper, and that gives you that kind of appearance. So that's what principally happens. That's what we've really got. So I'm going to break all the rules right now, and I'm going to sacrifice a piece of good paper for the sake of one of these tutorials. Normally when I'm doing just a sort of a techniques or an education tutorial, I use my sketchbook of shit paper that's really awful. I'm going to use a pretty good paper today. I'm going to be using LANGTON Prestige, which is a 100% cotton paper from Daler and Rowney. This is a block, and it is a 14-inch by 10-inch block, and I'll link to this in the description. It is a cold press paper. It's alright. I don't think the sizing's brilliant, so I have used this to produce things as gifts for people and for sale, and the smaller pieces I think actually are better. I think on a smaller scale it seems to work better, but the big pieces I find don't lie completely flat, because when the water soaks in, because the sizing's not exactly as I think it should be, these larger sheets do still buckle a little bit. And I've got my black pro marker here, and I'm just going to label up what we're going to look at. And you would normally never use an alcohol marker on watercolour paper because it eats the ink. But I'm doing writing, I'm not colouring, I'm not wasting ink, it's not really a big deal. Plus I have 6 of these black markers lying around. Really need to get some use out of it. So I'm going to put a flocculating colour down, which is going to be French Ultramarine, and I'm going to put a sedimenting colour down, which is going to be Caput Mortuum, I think. And the staining colours, I think I will probably be using... Let's do a Quinacridone red. Let's do Quinacridone Magenta. Just remember the mnemonic for staining is PQRS. Phthalocyanine, quinacridone, and reds stain. PQRS. That's how you remember your staining. So your quinacridones, your phthalocyanines, and anything red that is dye based is probably going to stain. That's my rough guide to it. I will do a glaze. There's a lot of people ask about glazing, so I'm going to add some glazing to this video. And what I'm going to do is I'll do Quin Magenta, and then over the top of it when it's dry, I'll do Pyrolle Orange, because I know that's transparent enough and I can see it. Now that's important. I need something I can reach quickly, because it's quite late at night, it's coming up to bedtime. I'm just doing this as a kind of last minute wind down before bed. So I'm going to put the granulating colours on first, and I'm not obviously using any mediums, I'm just using water. Now with flocculation, as I've mentioned before, if you've got a bit of extra water around, because these paints don't like water, or the pigments don't like water, you can actually encourage granulation by using excess water, really. The more wet it is, the more likely you are to get good granulation. So I'm picking it up from a large pan, and these will be linked in the video description if anyone is trying to get hold of them. And I'm just popping that into water. It's just damp paper there. And I'm just going to let that do its thing. I'm going to leave a gap there. And that is a Pro Art size 12 Proline Plus filbert that I'm using there, which is one of my favourite kind of general brushes. I really love these brushes. I've had a size 8 for quite a few months now, and I bought a size 12, and I just love them. They're not too expensive, but they're not really cheap either. They've got a good snap to them, but they're soft. So they're good for watercolour, but they've got a little bit of edge to them, which I really like. So just bear with me a second, because some silly man, which was me, decided in his wisdom that he was going to do a making something video for you guys, and it involved painting glass, and I got all the stuff out to do it and just couldn't be bothered, basically. So I'll do that another time, and all the stuff's kind of shoved off to one side, which was rather silly of me. But there we go. I am a rather silly man, if you ask anybody with any brain cells. Right, Quinacridone Magenta next. So I'm just going to pop the staining colours on first. Oh, actually no, I'll put the Caput Mortuum on first, because I said I'd do all of this side. Because I also, it's terribly grotty water. I also want you to be able to see that they do take a little while. You do have to give them a little bit of time to do their thing. It's not an instant effect. So Caput Mortuum is a iron oxide, and they have a tendency to sediment. How do you predict flocculation versus sedimentation? Not easy, but what I will say is that flocculation tends to happen with silicates. Some oxides do it, all silicates do it. Anything that is really hydrophobic, and that tends to be silicates, oxides to an extent, and actually some phosphates do. So I'll pop a phosphate on here as well, because I've got a phosphate paint on this palette. So let's put one of those on. This is a permanent mauve, and the Winsor & Newton permanent mauve is manganese phosphate, is the pigment, and that's a mineral too. Now be careful if you're looking at permanent mauves, because not all permanent mauves are equal. Some permanent mauves are just dioxazine violet with a filler, so do have a really careful look at what the instructions on the back of the tube say before you buy it. You know, really make sure that what you're buying is what you think you're buying when you're selecting paints. Now, it's quite a subdued colour, which I like about it. It's just one thing. It's a metal phosphate, you know, off-the-shelf chemical mixed into the gum arabic and all of the other chemicals that are in there. So it's a really chemically simple paint, which I kind of like about it. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to kind of over-wet one half, so we can see what the difference is. Now, if it's really wet, if it's going to flocculate, we'll be able to see it. If it's not, it'll look fairly similar on both sides, because it'll just sediment. I'm also going to slap on another colour, because, hey, I've got some. This is a manganese blue. It's a fake manganese blue. It's not the real thing. Manganese blue is one of those paints that's really hard to get hold of, and yes, I know Daniel Smith makes it. Don't bother posting in the comments to tell me you can still get it from Daniel Smith. I know you can. It's not a colour I like that much. Never really cared. I have the fake one, which is basically similar to cerulean blue. I think it uses phthalo blue as the actual pigment, mixed with a filler and a granulating agent, so give it the effect of fake manganese blue. So it's manganese blue hue. Sorry about that really odd scratchy noise. That was my bracelet rubbing against the tripod. Sorry, that's all I can say really. So we're going to let those sedimenty colours do their sedimenty thing, while I put out now some staining colours, and then I show you what happens when we try to lift them. Sedimenting colours, to be honest, actually tend to lift more easily than anything else, because they're not really bound to anything. They're just kind of sitting on the paper in big lumps, and you can usually kind of get that to lift up if you want to. So I'm trying to use very little water because I want this to dry pretty quickly. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to paint next to it some Pyrolle orange, so that when I do the glazing, I'm going to do it in both directions. I'll do an orange over magenta and a magenta over orange, and then we'll be able to see which one lifts, which one stains, and how that glazing works. The trick when glazing as well is to try and get each layer reasonably thin, because you want light showing through. You know, you want them thin enough to get some luminosity. You don't want them kind of caked on. Otherwise, what's the point? You know, the whole point of a glaze is it's two delicate thin layers. Now, while they're doing their thing, I might show you some other mixes. So let's have a little look first of all. So that French Ultramarine, let's get you in focus there. I think you can see it is granulating nicely. It's not a dramatic granulation, it's a flocculation. So it's still very wet, it'll take a while to come together. You can see a sedimentation here, and they're always quite obvious because when sedimentation happens, you almost get this kind of cracking effect. So let me see if I can get this close enough for you to see. Around about here, where's my finger gone? There it is. Around about this area here, you can kind of see ridges and lines forming, and that's quite common with sedimenting colours, that they sort of run into river deltas and crevices and so on, and they do make these kind of organic crunchy shapes, but we've got to let it dry down thoroughly. The manganese phosphate there, the permanent mauve, you can see has got beautiful granulation over here. That's sold, I think, as mineral purple in some ranges. And where I re-wetted it, not much difference, but it needs to dry down. And then the one that we know has got a fake granulating agent in it to give it a bit of texture is just starting to granulate. These staining colours, of course, don't granulate because these are staining colours, and staining colours, some do granulate actually, but these don't. I am going to show you what happens now where we use a granulating colour with a staining colour, because that's pretty interesting. So I'm going to put green gold, which is one of my very favourite colours, Ergodan yellow, azo green as it's known, and I'm going to put a decent amount on. I mean, I want a really thick layer. You'll notice I'm being pretty rough with this brush. That's because the wonderful thing about these Pro Art brushes is you can actually give them quite a beating. The bristles are really strong. Proline is actually a surgical thread. It's what's used to sew up dead, well, not dead people, live people really. It's what's used in surgery. And Proline Plus is a modified version. So I'm spotting in now some of that really horrible oxide of chromium green that lots of people dislike, and letting it dilute around there. Because I found when you do it with green gold in the background, you can get a really interesting effect. And the other one I'll do is I'll do an ultramarine one as well. I'll do some Quin Magenta. Again, I want this one really thick. And then I'll pop some ultramarine over the top of that, let it granulate in, and that will give us that kind of rose of ultramarine look that is in my faking it video that I mentioned earlier. Because what will happen is the ultramarine will granulate, and as it does, some of it will fall under the pink, some of it will sit on top of the pink, so we'll almost get a blue, a purple and a pink all together, and that's caused by a mixture of sedimentation and flocculation happening. And it'll be really pretty. So just test if these are dry, and the test, of course... Oh, I think you're a little bit out of focus. I'm so sorry. I always forget to check you're back in focus. So the test for if these are dry is back of the hand, and if it feels colder than the rest of the paper, they're still wet. And I think they're pretty much okay. I'm touching it with my palm because grease doesn't matter, you know. I'm just doing something for you. I'm not keeping this. I'm going to paint on the back of this. So let's do a thin Pyrolle orange glaze over the top. Don't want it too concentrated, but we don't want it so insipid that there's no point. I've just done the wrong Quin Magenta pool. What I was meant to do was glaze this one and lift this one. Bollocks to it. Life's too short to worry. And yes, I know, I have a mouth like a Steve door. It's late at night, ladies and gentlemen. I'm terrible, I know. I do flag these videos as unsuitable for children if I can. When I have said more than crap, you know, I do tend to bother, if I remember. These large pans, incidentally, I'm really enjoying having. I think they're really, really nice. And I did notice I went onto my Associates report on Amazon Associates, because obviously all the links and so on that I post to Amazon, I get a tiny commission back. And I went on, and usually, you know, I'm lucky if I get £5 a month back in commission off of the 2 Amazon sites that I use. And I went in and there was like 30 quid. And I looked, and people have gone mad buying these. And it's really nice for me, because obviously I think I get about £1 back on these, actually. The commission rate's really pretty good. I don't know whether I'm allowed to tell you that. Sod it, I've told you now. But someone or someone's has been buying them like absolute crazy. So, you know, buying multiples of the same colour, unless it's loads and loads of people have all gone mad and bought them. I think it's just 1 or 2, because the purchases were done in a really short space of time. So someone clearly likes them as well and wanted to get hold of them, which was really cool. So I was really pleased with that. Thank you very much, whoever that was, because that money goes back into my channel. That's what I do with it. So that money, that £10 or whatever, will all add up. And then what I do is I decide, okay, what do I want to review next? What do I want to get hold of next? And I use that money to do it with. So I don't take any personal profit from it, really, even though I put a lot of personal money into this channel when I started to buy things to review. But actually, most of the things I review, I'm buying because I want to use them, rather than buying because I want to try them out necessarily. It is often quite different. So anyway, I just wanted to let those dry a moment, and I thought I'd witter for a moment there. I'm going to use a pretty hard brush now. I'm going to use a yellow nylon, which is not gold Taclon, this is nylon. It's on the other end of a colour shaper from Royal Sovereign. Come on, focus, you damn thing. There we go. Nearly. Oh, come on, you want to focus, you know you want to. Oh, look, it's a Royal Sovereign colour shaper. You don't need to see it. But it's a nice firm nylon brush, so it's good for lifting. And what I wanted to do was, I don't have one of those little lifting stencils that people use that I think are designed for pencil, for erasing. So what I'm going to do instead is put a ruler on here, and I'm going to lift next to the ruler. And quinacridones stain pretty strongly, so it's probably not going to lift very well. And I am scrubbing on the paper because I don't care about the paper. I'm just trying to lift some paint. And I find a nylon brush is a really good brush to use for this. Gold Taclon, which is the standard synthetic that we use in watercolour and acrylic, I think isn't quite hard enough. You need a pretty stiff brush if you're going to try that out. Don't, whatever you do, really don't use a sable brush, because you are going to completely ruin it. And I feel really bad when people throw real hairbrushes away. I know I've mentioned this before, but as far as I'm concerned, I make a personal choice to use real hairbrushes. I feel bad about it, but I use them. If I damage one of those brushes, that animal died completely pointlessly. Now, if I've got a squirrel hairbrush and I make it last 20 years, I don't feel quite so bad. But when people break them because they don't know what they're doing with them, I get really irritated, because that, I think, is disrespectful to the animal. And I know the whole process is disrespectful to the animal, but it's like welfare at slaughter. If we're going to do it, we may as well do it respectfully. But that's not really an argument I want to get into, so please don't comment on that. I don't like political comments. I can't be bothered with them. So I'm just trying to scratch out or scrub out a couple of lines of colour here, and because I'm not doing it carefully, I'm spreading the colour out rather than lifting it. And I find these microfiber cloths are really good for getting the moisture off because they pick up all of it without needing to do much. And you can actually rub the paper with them without taking sizing off, which is really cool. Now, when you are lifting, the problem often is with heavily staining colours, they don't lift very well. We're going to see that here now. These staining colours like Quin Magenta don't lift well. Now, if this was Milford paper with a hard size, or sometimes Alsh with its hard sizing, that would probably come off even after 2 or 3 days. But for most papers, I mean, this is a cotton paper, it's pretty heavily sized, and even the Pyrolle orange doesn't come off. What you need to do if you want to use really heavily staining paint, your PQRS rule, what you need to do is buy a medium called lifting medium. And what lifting medium is a kind of like sizing. You paint it on, you let it dry, you paint your paint over the top, and it stops the paint interacting with the paper properly, so you can lift it really easily even weeks later. It kind of puts a film on the paper to enable you to lift. So that's the theory behind lifting medium if you ever want to use it. So you can see there where I did these glazes. It's really hard to see actually. I'm going to pick you up and move you, so it's all going to be wibbly wobbly wobbly very, very, very shortly. But it's going to enable me... Sorry about that. I'll just cut you off. I'm going to apologise for the wibbly wobbliness, but I wanted to show you up close with good lighting what that looks like lifted. And where I've done this glaze here, you've got this lovely Pyrolle orange here. Excuse the green gold that's kind of sneaking in from the side. Lovely Pyrolle orange, and where the glaze is, you've got the pink underneath. You can still see it's pink. That does not look like a pink-orange mixture. The pink has kept its identity in this marriage. It has not taken the surname of the orange. When we go down here, and we look at the orange, which again does not lift very well, both staining colours, the orange has kept its identity underneath the pink. So that's what the point of glazing is. It's to enable us to see both of the colours. It's not the same as mixing. Glazing is one of the most important techniques in watercolour, so it's really important to learn that. Let's just move over to the granulators now. So the Flocculating French Ultramarine. I'm going to apologise if someone will comment, the camera works all shaky, it's not fair. Sorry, it's really hard to film paper close up. So if you look at this area, granulation's pretty obvious around here. You've got fairly strong granulation. You can see it all over here. It's speckly and spotty and crackly. That's really good granulation there. And people are like, oh, but is granulating paint a bad thing? Hell no, it's great. If I want a cloud or a rock, granulation's amazing. But if I want a petal of a flower that I don't want any texture on, I just wouldn't use French Ultramarine. I'd use a dye-based blue. So Caput Mortuum here, you've got these deep cracks and crevices forming. There you go, you can see it's a very different type of sedimentary effect. It's not the same kind of granulation. It's heavier, it's got these dense patches here, like this really dense ridge across here. Imagine what that's like if you're painting rocks or the edge of a mountain. The texture and dimension it gives you is absolutely amazing. Whereas the French Ultramarine, even if you knock it down with burnt sienna, it doesn't give you that ridgy effect. Moving down, it's some more extreme granulation here. This is sedimentation, and this is of permanent mauve, manganese phosphate, aka mineral purple. If you add more water to it, it just kind of spreads out, but it does the same thing. So it's not flocculation, it's not encouraged by water. And this one's got a slight granulating medium added to it, that faux manganese blue. So it's got a very subtle granulation, but it's really not much. So I just wanted to show you how they looked in comparison to one another. And one thing you can do with these sedimenting colours, really easily actually, it's probably too dry to do it now, but let's have a try, is with these brushes with the plastic handles, you will know the ones, you can sometimes actually lift off that paint where it's built up. And now it's too dry there and it's not going to work without damaging the paper. But sometimes you can actually lift it off, which is useful when you're painting walls. Let's have a look at those mixtures I made. So this mixture here, it's almost psychedelic mixture here, was green gold with oxide of chromium. Now, oxide of chromium sediments rather than flocculates. Sedimentary colours are the ones that tend to look a little bit dull. The flocculating ones are the ones that tend to keep more luminosity. So you can see it's quite a subtle sedimentation, but I don't know if you can see, it's all along this edge here. There's an undertone of yellow because the green gold has sunk underneath. And again here. So if you want to make an awful colour that you don't like look more exciting, and it's one of these granulating, sedimenting colours, just paint it over the top of a really vivid staining colour or a really vivid dye-based colour. So I could take Caput Mortuum and paint it over the top of Quinacridone Gold, or I could paint it over the top of Quinacridone Violet, something like that, and it would work in the same way. It would just liven it up from underneath. So you can imagine if I completely painted all of that green, just having that little yellow subtle background makes a huge difference to that muddy colour that you normally have. It actually adds interest and dimension to an unpopular colour. This one I did here, which was French Ultramarine with Quinacridone Magenta, which is not actually a mixture I've ever done before, because I would normally do this with Quinacridone Rose. It's got some really interesting colours, and the way they've mixed together is really cool as well. There's some flocculation happening, you've got some really interesting luminosity going on there. Let me turn the paper. I mean, you can see some fantastic different colours, textures. It's really pretty. I really like that. It reminds me of the petal on a pansy or something like that. So there you are. If you are trying to get to grips with sedimentation and granulation and staining and all these awful words, all you need to remember is that staining just means will it lift or won't it on a standard paper. Most things will lift on hard size paper. So things like Arche, most things are going to lift. Whereas on a standard paper like Bockingford or Langton Prestige, things will not be quite so lucky. So that's the way it's kind of defined. It's what will they do on a standard paper. That's the way I think of them anyway. I tend to think of staining is on a standard paper, not on a hard size paper. Granulating will happen on most papers, but it'll happen better on a paper with a texture. If you use rough paper, you can get some fantastic granulating effects. Why not try some of the following ones if you really want to experiment? Try French Ultramarine with Permanent Rose and Burnt Umber. What you'll get from that is the most wonderful dark midnight purple. But when it granulates, it gets a black granulation on top of a bright purple field, and it's so beautiful. I've used it recently in part of a present for a friend of a kind of misty Central American jungle. It's a friend who's homesick, who's from Costa Rica. It's a gorgeous colour. I'm really impressed with it. One of the other ones that's really nice as a weird mixture as well is phthalo green blue shade with cobalt violet. You get bright pink granulation on top of a bright green field. And actually, it's a really interesting one to try for adding texture to green areas. I've already shown you the green gold cobalt oxide. That also works with Viridian with green gold as well. And then French Ultramarine will work with any of the quinacridones to give you all sorts of really interesting effects. So that's one way you can kind of liven things up and get some different textures. Venetian Red is another strong granulator. Venetian Red in with French Ultramarine or Cobalt Blue. That's going to give you some really interesting, really intense granulation. But one of my favourites is always Caput Mortuum for that really heavy particle size. And that has meant that this area here that you can't really appreciate on film, and you never can with watercolour, you've got this beautiful reddish brown along here and this undertone of an almost purplish flat brown. And it already looks like the edge of a mountain with ridges, even though all I did was wet an area, slap some paint on. It's given me a texture, which is really cool. And Permanent Mauve is a great one because it gives you that wonderful granulation where you've got purple in the distance. So again, that one I think I'd like to try using with something like phthalo blue red shade underneath it to give me that interesting articulated texture. So there we go. That was staining and granulating and the different types of granulating, flocculating and sedimenting with me, the Spin Doctor. All the supplies I've used are going to be linked in the video description below, and as always they are affiliate links to either Amazon UK, Amazon USA or dickblick.com, aka Blick Art Materials. If you buy through those, a very small percentage comes to me. It doesn't cost you a penny more than it would cost you if you went to those websites and found the items yourself. It just kind of thanks me for, it's a finder's fee, basically, from the company to me for sending you in their direction. Nothing more, nothing less. So if you see something you like, go ahead and buy it. Very often, I will try really hard to find you the best price in either the US or the UK when I link. If it's not available in your jurisdiction, I will write that it's not available in the US. That's quite often the case with some of the obscure Winsor & Newton products. But you should be able to get all of these products really easily. I would say that LANGTON Prestige paper, I know in the US, is really, really expensive. I would suggest Saunders Waterford as a fairly equivalent, though I think Waterford is a better paper, or any of the cotton papers. Don't go straight to Arches unless you're really confident with it, is all I can say. If you're moving from wood to cotton, start with a paper like LANGTON Prestige or Saunders Waterford. Get used to it before you move on to hard sizing. There is my advice. Okay, thank you all very much and good evening.